Once there was a man the world envied, not for his armies or conquest, not for his chariots or fame, but for something rarer, something holy. He wore the crown of a kingdom, yes, but also the mantle of divine favor. His name was Solomon, son of David, born of Bathsheba, a boy woven into prophecy and promise. And when the old king's breath faded and Solomon rose to the throne, heaven didn't simply nod. It thundered. He was not just a man chosen by blood. He was chosen by God. And the Lord came to him in the night. There, beneath the stars at Gibeon, while the campfires still crackled and Israel slept, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream and whispered a question that could have changed history, and did. Ask. Just that. One word, one holy invitation. If the Creator of all things came to you tonight with the same offer, what would you ask? Most would choose wealth, power, victory, long life. But Solomon didn't. He bowed his soul and asked for something eternal. Give your servant a discerning heart, he said, to govern your people and distinguish between right and wrong. It was a request not for himself, but for justice, for truth, for others. And heaven rejoiced. God not only granted his request, but poured out riches he hadn't even asked for. Gold beyond counting, honor above all kings, and peace in the land. So long as he walked in obedience, God promised his days would be long and his legacy lasting. And so began the reign of the wisest man who ever lived. But even at the height of his wisdom, a question hung in the air like incense rising from the altar. Would wisdom alone be enough to keep a heart from wandering? That's the quiet danger of every gifted soul. Not the lack of wisdom, but the loss of wonder, of worship. And it wouldn't take long before the gift Solomon had been given was tested. 2 women came before the king, a child between them, both claiming to be the mother. There was no evidence, no witnesses, just agony. And the court held its breath as Solomon called for a sword. A sword? To cut the baby in 2? The crowd must have trembled. But Solomon wasn't delivering justice by the blade. He was drawing truth out by love. For the true mother cried out, "No, let the child live. Give him to her." And that was all Solomon needed. Wisdom had spoken. A mother's heart had revealed itself. And the people marveled, whispering, "Surely the Spirit of God lives in this king." From that moment forward, Solomon's name echoed far beyond Israel's borders. A philosopher king, poet, warrior, builder of nations and temples. He wrote 3,000 proverbs, penned over 1,000 songs. His words reached deep into the soul, cutting between flesh and spirit, dividing shadow from light. But it wasn't just his mind that stunned the world. It was the presence. God was with him. And one day, that divine presence would descend upon something greater than Solomon's wisdom, the temple he built. But before the temple came the queen. She traveled from the ends of the earth, the Queen of Sheba, not to trade silk or spices, but to test this man of God. She came with riddles, questions so complex that only heaven could answer them. And Solomon, he answered everyone without hesitation, without flaw. When she saw his palace, his court, the food on his table, the robes of his servants, and the burnt offerings he made in the temple, her breath left her body. I heard stories, she confessed, but not even half the truth was told to me. And it wasn't flattery. It was awe. This wasn't about Solomon. It was about the God who walked with him, a nation blessed not because of brilliance, but because of obedience. But that's the tragedy waiting quietly in the shadows. You see, the brighter the light, the longer the shadow it casts. Solomon's crowning achievement was yet to come, the building of the temple in Jerusalem. 7 years of construction, cedar from Lebanon, walls overlaid in gold, furnishings of bronze and silver, a structure not just built by hands, but by hearts aligned with heaven. And when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the most holy place, the glory came. A cloud descended. The priests couldn't stand. God had entered the house built by men. Solomon prayed aloud in front of all Israel, hands lifted, tears falling, voice trembling. And he said, "Lord, there is no God like you, who keeps your covenant of love with your servants who walk before you with all their heart." That was the highest moment of his life, not when he was crowned, not when he judged, not when he wrote, but when he worshipped. And the heavens answered. But as we'll soon see, the presence of God is not a guarantee of obedience, and blessings, if not guarded, can become burdens. Solomon's story begins in glory, but it does not end there, because even the wisest can fall. And sometimes the greatest threat to a man's soul is not what he lacks, but what he has. The kingdom sparkled, not with snow, not with stars, but with gold. Under Solomon's reign, silver was considered worthless. It lined the gutters, filled bowls in back halls. The palace of the forest of Lebanon gleamed not with iron or brass, but with solid gold goblets golden shields, golden steps leading to a golden throne carved from ivory, guarded by lions standing tall on either side. 12 of them, one for every tribe of Israel. The air inside the royal chambers smelled not of sweat or fear, but of frankincense and myrrh. Courtyards rang with music, laughter, the clinking of crystal, and the low hush of scribes translating wisdom into parchment. It was a golden age, but gold, as always, has two sides. It blinds as easily as it blesses. From every corner of the earth, rulers and merchants sought audience with Solomon. 1 Kings 10 tells us, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Imagine that. Pharaohs, sultans, emperors, men who commanded armies bowed just to listen. And Solomon welcomed them, offering counsel, strategy, and eventually alliances, political ones, marital ones, treaties forged not with ink, but with kisses and bridal veils. At first, it was diplomacy, then indulgence, then idolatry. The cracks began slow, invisible, like rot beneath the floorboards. Solomon's heart, once fully God's, began to stretch thin, divided between the one who gave him everything and the many who offered him everything else. 1 Kings 11 whispers what history groans. King Solomon loved many foreign women, not one, not 10, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and with them came gods, Moabite idols, Ammonite demons, Sidonian fertility rites, Hittite statues, sacred poles, high places built on hills not for the Lord, but for the dead and the damned. And Solomon, the same man who once built a temple for the glory of God, now built altars for Molech, the god who demanded the screams of sacrificed children. How? How could a man so wise, so anointed, drift so far? It wasn't sudden. It was slow. It was small decisions, silent justifications, whispers in the dark. He still wore the robes, still sat on the throne, still recited proverbs to his sons, and drank from golden goblets. But his heart no longer belonged to the God who made him king. And God noticed. Twice the Lord had appeared to Solomon, once in the quiet of Gibeon, and again in the holy fire of the temple's dedication. Twice. A rarity even among prophets. But now the fire was gone. The voice was silent. And in its place, idols. So God spoke again. This time, not with promises, but with judgment. Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant, I will certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Can you feel the weight of that decree? The kingdom wasn't just being punished. It was being broken. Not during Solomon's lifetime, out of mercy for his father David, but in the days of his son. The golden age would shatter, not with swords, but with divided hearts, and in a single, strange, prophetic act, the truth was revealed. The prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam, a servant in Solomon's court, on a quiet road outside the city. No fanfare, no thunder, just fabric. Ahijah took off his new cloak, one that had never been worn, and tore it into 12 pieces. Then, with shaking hands, he said, "Take 10, for this is what the Lord says. I am going to tear the kingdom from Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes." 10 torn pieces. 10 tribes torn from David's line. A kingdom that had once stood united, a blazing torch in the ancient world, now doomed to be fractured by one man's drift. And Solomon? He tried to kill Jeroboam. A final gasp of control, but God's plan would not be undone. The end had begun. Still, in the palace, the music played. The servants bowed. The banquets continued. But beneath the glimmering gold, dust gathered. In Solomon's chambers, silence grew, because all the gold in the world cannot mend a heart cracked by compromise. And wisdom, no matter how deep, cannot save a soul that no longer listens. In part 3, we'll descend into the final, most tragic days of Solomon's life, when the echoes of regret began to haunt the man once called beloved of the Lord. His crown was still on his head, but the light in his eyes had already faded. The halls of Solomon's palace had grown quieter, not empty. No, the feasts still happened, the servants still scurried, and the goblets still overflowed. But there was a stillness, a kind of hush that doesn't come from reverence, but from absence. Something, someone, was missing. The glory, the same glory that once descended like a cloud upon the temple, was gone. Solomon still sat on the throne, clothed in purple and gold, but in his eyes the fire of his youth had dimmed, and behind the throne, in the shadows, the weight of his compromises loomed. He had built cities, towers, and a temple that made the nations gasp in awe. But now he was building altars to gods who did not speak, gods who could not hear, gods who demanded blood but gave no life in return. The man who once prayed, "Give me wisdom to judge your people," now judged himself silently, relentlessly, every time he walked past an idol he had commissioned. You could feel the ache in the air, the ache of a man who had tasted heaven and now gnawed on dust. And somewhere deep within the palace walls, between the echoes of laughter and the clinking of wealth, Solomon took up a pen, not to write another proverb for his sons, not to counsel future kings, but to process the weight of it all. That writing became a book, Ecclesiastes, and its opening words sound less like the King of Israel and more like the cry of a man who's lost everything that mattered. Meaningless, meaningless, Solomon writes. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. These aren't the musings of a man who never knew truth. They're the reflections of a man who once held it in his hands and let it slip through his fingers. He had once written, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Now, in his old age, he mourned what he had forgotten. He had tried to fill the void with vineyards and gardens, with palaces and possessions, with singers, concubines, and endless luxuries. He denied himself nothing, no pleasure, no pursuit. But in the silence that followed every indulgence, he felt it. Emptiness. He writes in Ecclesiastes 2:11, "When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." The wind. That's what it all felt like now. The throne, the wives, the gold. It all slipped through his hands like vapor, no matter how tightly he clutched it, and the memories came back. He remembered the day the ark was carried into the Holy of Holies. He remembered the cloud that filled the temple, the priests falling on their faces, the glory of God settling like a hush on the nation. He remembered what it was to be close to God. And now he could hardly hear him. The idols stood tall in the hills. The sacred groves whispered with rituals not of Israel. And Solomon? He watched, not with defiance, but with regret, because somewhere along the way, he had stopped listening. The same God who had given him wisdom, wealth, peace, even his own presence, had not changed. But Solomon had. He had traded devotion for diplomacy. He had allowed affection to overrule obedience. And slowly, silently, he had drifted, not in rebellion, but in neglect. It was the quiet compromise of a king that cost him everything sacred. He writes in Ecclesiastes 5:10, "Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This, too, is meaningless." It wasn't a theory. It was confession. This was a man surrounded by more gold than any other ruler on earth, and he could still feel the ache of hunger inside, because no amount of gold can cover the guilt of a heart that's wandered from its first love. And now, in his final days, Solomon had only words. No armies could stop the coming judgment. No alliance could delay the prophecy. The kingdom would divide. His son Rehoboam would inherit not just a throne, but a curse. And Solomon knew it. Yet even as the shadow fell over his legacy, even as the future splintered before his fading eyes, there was something else in his words. A flicker of hope, a final flame. Because Ecclesiastes doesn't end in despair. It ends in truth. A truth forged not in youth, but in sorrow. In Ecclesiastes 12:13, Solomon writes, "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." The king who once spoke to nations now speaks to you, not with the wisdom of a rising ruler, but with the broken voice of a man who strayed and still found grace. The palace had never been more silent. No music echoed through its gilded halls. No royal decree thundered from the throne. No laughter, no revelry, only the soft shuffle of sandals across marble, and the whisper of old curtains swaying in the desert breeze. Solomon, once the voice that made nations tremble, now sat alone in a chamber flooded with twilight. The golden vessels still gleamed around him. The scent of cedar still hung in the air. His robes were still heavy with threads of silver, but his shoulders slumped, and his eyes, those once piercing eyes that saw through lies and unlocked riddles, were clouded with something deeper than age. Regret. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was everywhere. In the silence between breaths. In the shadow of the temple he could see from his window. In the ashes of the altars he had built. Not for God, but for the gods of his wives. He remembered them all. Ashtoreth, Molech, Chemosh. He remembered the shrines he'd commissioned with his own seal. The ceremonies he'd tolerated. The boundaries he'd once sworn he'd never cross. Now blurred, broken, forgotten. And worst of all, he remembered the voice that had once called to him in dreams, the voice that had said, "Ask," the voice that filled the temple with holy fire. That voice was silent now, not gone, not powerless, just distant. And Solomon, the wisest of men, finally knew what it meant to be a fool. He had reached the mountaintop of success and found the summit empty. He had dined with queens, held the world's treasures in his hands, and been envied by kings. But none of it could hold the weight of his soul. None of it could hush the ache in his heart. What do you do when you've built everything and still feel hollow? He returned to his writings, not to craft more proverbs for the courts, but to leave behind a final truth, something raw, something honest, something that could pierce through the centuries and reach hearts like yours and mine. He no longer wore the voice of a king. He spoke like a man who had stared eternity in the face. And his words were not polished. They were haunted. Ecclesiastes 2, 10-11. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. That's what it all was. The gardens, the music, the women, the palaces, the ships full of peacocks and gold, wind, a mirage in the desert. Solomon remembered standing in the temple courts years before, his arms lifted high, crying out, "There is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath." And now he sat beneath that same heaven, whispering, "Where did I go?" He thought of his father, David, flawed but faithful, a man who repented with tears and danced before the ark of the covenant. Solomon's heart ached for that kind of devotion again. He wasn't weeping over the loss of gold. He wasn't grieving the loss of fame. He was mourning the distance between him and the God he once loved. Have you ever felt it? That sense that you've drifted too far, that the silence of God is louder than thunder? That was Solomon's final ache. He knew his time was near. The breath in his lungs felt thinner. The corners of the palace seemed darker. And yet, even here, in the twilight of failure, he had something to say. Not to justify himself, not to reclaim his throne, but to warn and to hope. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, he writes in Ecclesiastes 12:1. Before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, "I find no pleasure in them." He was too late for himself, but not for you. And that's the beauty of Solomon's end. He didn't die screaming. He didn't die hiding. He died writing, confessing, and pointing back to the fear of the Lord, back to obedience, back to the path he had once walked, but lost beneath golden stones and silver lies. His final truth stands like a monument, unmoved by time. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. The once golden king was now the quiet sage, and with his last whisper, he begged the world not to follow him off the cliff he built with his own hands.